Thank you everyone for joining today. Again, my name is Matt Duran. I am the incident response lead for LMG Security, Black Hat instructor, RSA speaker. And check us out near the end of the year. We'll be coming out with a new book called Ransomware and Cyber Extortion, being authored by myself and Sherry Davidoff and Karen Springer, also from LMG Security. We're very excited to be able to offer this out as a supplemental resource to anyone who is interested in cybersecurity or just wants to learn more about how cyber response functions and the best way to bring a business back from the brink after a catastrophic cyber event. All right, so we can't start off the webinar today without talking about major pieces of cyber news. So I figured the best way to go about this would be to talk about the Kaseya hack. REvil ransomware shut down the Kaseya VSA service, the on-premise remote monitoring and management system that a lot of managed service providers and IT companies use to, well, manage networks for their clients. This was kind of a big deal. It was actually the largest ransomware attack on record as far as number of devices compromised goes. And they shut down everything. There was a small Maryland town that was taken completely offline. One of Sweden's largest grocery store chains was completely knocked off, all because of this one single attack. So, as we mentioned before, who done it? Well, this was the REvil ransomware group. And if you follow cybersecurity in the news or have been looking at major cyber incident recently, the name of this group should sound familiar. They are infamous at this point for taking down large-scale organizations and usually attacking via the supply chain. They recently took down the Sol Orion's nuclear weapons contractor for the United States, so kind of a big problem there, I would say. They were also recently behind the JBS hack, which took one of the nation's largest food distributors offline. Again, a very costly and impactful event, almost on par with Colonial Pipeline as far as the number of individuals that were impacted by it. Now, we bring this up to talk about a very important piece of the response that often gets overlooked. In every single one of these situations where one of these mass cyber attacks happened, proper monitoring and proper logging paired with proper response could have minimized a lot of the damage. In a lot of cases, this was not done, however. The reasons for that are far between, but my hope with this webinar is to give you an example of how to properly configure your logging and monitoring, why it's important, what we would like to look at, and the real reasons behind why we put time into this in the first place. We want to be able to detect threats quickly, as in before the ransomware gets deployed. We want to be able to respond quickly, and we want to be prepared for an investigation if that is needed after a cyber event occurs. So in today's roadmap, we're going to go over a few different things. We'll be going over monitoring and logging fundamentals, just the basics on what you need to know. We'll be going through detecting incidents early on in the process. We'll go through sources of logs and evidence, where we can find the data on the network, and how we can actually maintain that data. We'll also talk about the cloud and the unique challenges that cloud logging and cloud monitoring bring to the table, especially since COVID-19 has moved so many individual businesses into cloud services that they may not otherwise have been prepared to use. We'll talk about Centralize and collection, and then we'll give you a checklist for monitoring and logging as we go through the presentation. We'll also address the pros and cons by going through a couple of different case studies. Now, I'm excited to bring these to you. These are cases that I've worked where monitoring was either done well and we had adequate data to go through and come up with a good conclusion, or let's just say monitoring was not done quite as well. And there were gaps in the information that we had available that led to some inconclusive items and potential problems for reporting once we were done. So, of course, we are going to start out with the kind of the negative aspect of the story. Someone that may not have had things in a proper configuration and may not have had everything they needed for a proper investigation. We were working with a professional services firm. They had an internal client information database that had data on roughly 1,200 current and previous clients, all maintaining clear text and accessible on the network. The database contents included things like billing information, routing numbers, financial data, client information, a lot of things that we do not want getting out the door in the case of a cyber incident. So what happened here? Well, there was a ransomware detonation inside the network. All of the computers, all of the servers, and everything else on the network at the time the detonation happened was completely encrypted. Unfortunately, this also included the backups for the network, so the client had no real way to recover from the ransomware impact at that point. There was a complete halt in operations, and the ransom demand was $5 million from the individual actor. Now, when we start into an investigation like this, there are some baseline questions that we really want to answer. And normally these are pushed by both the client, legal counsel, insurance, and anyone else with an interest in the outcome of the investigation. First off, how exactly did the attacker get in? Do they still have access? Are they still inside the network while we're doing the investigation, which becomes problematic if there's an active infection going? Was data stolen? That's the number one question that we get asked anytime we're moving into one of these types of investigations, and then what laws, regulations, or contracts might relate to the data that you have. Remember, data breach notification laws are different for almost every state, and if you have data on members from or on people from other states, you have to follow their data breach notification laws. Very, very detail-oriented part of the process. So as I kind of hinted at, we had a lot of unavailable data. We had gaps in the available logging and monitoring, which made things pretty difficult to work through. There was no centralized log storage available on the network. All of the antivirus logs, which were only Windows Defender, were encrypted during the ransomware attack. So we had a very kind of black hole of information there. Firewall and network logs only lived on the devices that were being used in the network at the time. They weren't being stored anywhere. And if you've ever tried to recover log data from a firewall or another network device, the logs on there are pretty short-lived. I mean, you're lucky if you've got a couple of hours worth of log content to go off of, let alone days. And we'll talk about why that distinction makes a big difference. And then they had an intrusion detection system, or an IDS, inside the network, but the license for the software had expired, so it was essentially a paperweight at that point. It wasn't really doing anything that was going to be useful for us. What they did have was what essentially every office has without even kind of blinking an eye as far as log retention goes. They had workstation and server logs. These are the built-in event logs that exist inside of Windows servers, Windows workstations, or any other pieces of equipment on your network. There are some things that we can tell from these, but there are a lot of things that we can't. Now, it's not to say these are not useful. They are absolutely, and they should be saved. Some of the things that we can get out of Windows event logs like this are very important to an investigation. We can get things like remote authentication events, so we can know when remote desktop protocol is being used, when users were successfully logging on and logging off. We can get shared folder access information, so we can see where in the network they might have looked and what data may have been exposed. We can also get things like scheduled tasks, which are a major piece of the malicious architecture when we see hackers actually breaking into networks. Scheduling or setting up scheduled tasks and detonating future pieces of malware, reinstalling their own malware. These are very common to see. We can also see privilege escalation. Was the attacker able to escalate up to an administrative role, or were they stuck at a standard user? This can affect what they're actually able to do. We can see operating system errors, other things that indicate problems on the network, and a lot more. Now, what they can't tell us is a little bit more important in this case. First off, we can't really tell data exfiltration from Windows event logs only. There are some limitations to what the logs actually keep track of that make that just a very difficult thing to do. We also have a hard time seeing network traffic. Like, we can see the authentications moving back and forth, but as far as data being passed between individual workstations or out to the public internet, the event logs really aren't going to tell us that. And then there's a good amount of malware indicators that we cannot see inside of that event log data. So again, something to keep in mind. Now, as we say you should maintain these, there are certain pieces of this that are going to be more important than others. So as a getting started guide, we've got a quick list of just a couple of the big hits that we go after. First off, Event ID 4624, successful network authentications. We want to know when people are signing on. We also want to know when the network authentications fail, so Event ID 4625. This can be a really good indicator of something like a brute force password guessing attack, or an improper configuration that's going to degrade network performance. So we want to see where those failed authentications are coming from and what their context is. Event ID 4648, login with explicit credentials. This is kind of a hallmark of escalating into a run as administrator kind of state on a workstation. Event ID 4698, scheduled task creation. Again, we talked about why that's important. And then remote desktop IDs, 21 through 25. All of these put together can give us a really good kind of timeline as to what exactly was done on a computer system, which accounts may have been compromised, what level of access they had, and a lot more. Now, luckily, there's an app for keeping track of these. We don't need to save all of the Windows event log data on a workstation. That could be a ridiculous amount of data if we were trying to maintain it for a long period of time. We can utilize some event forwarding to help target the pieces of the infrastructure that we want to log and maintain, grab just those, and then the other pieces of the log data that we're not really interested in will get left behind and rolled over on the host computer. But SolarWinds offers a log collection utility. Microsoft themselves offer one. Snare is another great example, and there are many more. So definitely something to keep a look at, or take a look at if this is a piece of your infrastructure you would like to maintain. Now, this also brings us to one of the kind of baseline recommendations we usually give people when they're coming into their initial monitoring and logging setups. What can I do to actually maintain this data, and more importantly, what can I do to effectively utilize it? The very first and foremost thing you should look at is a Syslog server. These have been around for a very, very long time. They store and categorize log data and can be set to retain for basically as long as you have hard drive space available. You can use them to display and visualize the events that you're pulling back, which can be really useful for quick analysis. If we're doing nothing but looking at big strings of text data, that's going to be pretty boring for our responders, and there's a good chance we're going to miss something. So if we can visualize those events and make things a lot easier to work with, we're going to have a much better time of that. We also want to be able to identify network issues and spot early attack indicators. Again, we can set up the Syslog server and the monitoring stuff ahead of time to give us a much better view as to what's actually happening on the network. Now, the nice part is Syslog is supported natively by most Unix and Mac operating systems, and there are utilities available for Windows. So this is a universal type of solution that will work in a lot of different organizations regardless of configuration. As long as you've got the hardware for it and you can pass data over the network, you're in pretty good shape as far as Syslog goes. But this isn't just for event logs. Syslog servers can maintain all kinds of different log data. So we're talking about things like antivirus and security software, business applications, like your critical applications that your business requires to run, peripheral devices, so things like routers and firewalls and other pieces of network infrastructure that generate log data can pipe all this log data back to a Syslog server for retention. It's very, very useful. Also, Internet of Things devices, if there's camera systems that you want to maintain data for, or smart locks, things like that. All of that produces data that can be pushed off. Okay, so into our investigation. Now, we were limited as to what we could see on the network. We were pretty much relegated to what was stored on the local computers and servers themselves. We didn't have any centralized storage or long-term retention, so we had to go with what we could get. Unfortunately, some of the logs on those computers were also encrypted. So things like the NT user hive, which gives us information relating to File Explorer activity, which, again, if you're looking at data, if data was stolen, that can be a pretty good indicator. Also, the webcache VO1 file. This is the Internet Explorer activity. Microsoft Edge activity. And this can give us a good idea if a file sharing site was being accessed, which, again, works towards data exfiltration. Windows Defender, we also identified, had been disabled via a registry change inside the computer. So that gave us an idea that they likely elevated to an administrative level position based on the changes they were able to make. Now, the $1,000,000 question for this one, was data stolen? This was kind of a tough one for us. The attackers actually said yes. They came back and told us, we stole data, and this is how we did it. They sent a screenshot of a file tree they claimed to have exfiltrated. They claimed that they had uploaded through mega.co.nz, which, if you're not familiar with the service, is a file sharing service similar to Dropbox. However, it operates outside of U.S. jurisdiction and law and is kind of notorious for having very little control over what exactly can be uploaded and downloaded to the site. A lot of cybercriminals will use Mega to transfer illicit files back and forth because of that lack of control. They did not provide any hard copies of files that they had claimed to have exfiltrated. They would only send us screenshots of file names. And they only provided proof of life, so ransomware test decryption, on files that we submitted to them and not on any of the files that they claimed to have. So there was reason for us to believe that this data may not have actually been taken out of the network, and the attacker was only using that to try to basically scare the client into paying a large ransom at that point. Unfortunately, though, we did not have enough evidence on the local system to conclusively determine whether or not this was true. So, as is the case a lot of times in a cyber investigation, we had to rely on the attorneys and legal counsel that we work with to make the call as to whether or not we were going to report this as a breach. And the attorneys said yes, assume that data was taken, report accordingly. I am not an attorney. I don't claim to be, but I will always go with an attorney when they make a determination like that. It is the smart play. It's out of an abundance of caution, and it can stop things from coming back and kind of biting you on the back end of an investigation. But this does bring up a risk of over notification. If there is a situation where you report a breach and no data was actually stolen, you've done some pretty significant damage to your reputation and potentially opened yourself up to some legal action without there being any proof that anything actually happened. But in this case, the breach was reported to all clients of the organization. So the other question we had was, were the attackers still in the network? We suspected they probably were, mainly because we did not have any visibility to prove that they were not. Not at first, anyway. We were able to drop in some software to take care of that, but we'll talk about that here in just a minute. But this brings up the concept of dwell time. And dwell time is a term that we use in cybersecurity to describe the amount of time that an attacker will lurk inside of a network. It's basically the amount of time between when they initially compromise and when they do something major and noticeable, like detonate ransomware. During this dwell time, they're performing a lot of different activities. So they're doing things like expanding their footprint, they're doing research, they're stealing data, and a lot of other stuff. Median dwell time is about 24 days for an average cyber incident. So again, that's almost a month's worth of time, where if things are being watched and monitored, we can catch this activity happening and stop this from becoming a much larger event. For ransomware, we've actually seen this decrease to about 5 days. The attackers seem to be getting a lot faster and pulling the trigger on ransomware detonations. And then non-ransomware investigations run about 45 days. So just to give you a basic idea of how this looks. This also gives us an opportunity to talk about the pyramid of pain. This is a threat hunting tactic that we rely on when we're moving into a new network. And this is what we had to apply in this new situation. Basically, what we're looking at here is how hard a specific piece of network information or system information is for a hunter to identify versus how hard is it for the adversary to change and obfuscate. And this also becomes important because you can see there's 6 levels to the pyramid of pain. 5 of those 6 levels can be really addressed by some simple monitoring and logging configurations. Basic view of network traffic, basic antivirus configurations, not a ton of extra work, and you've knocked out most of the pieces of this pyramid, or at least made it very difficult for an adversary to remain undetected in the network. Here's an example of that. This is what we call a heartbeat. So malware, in a lot of cases, will phone home to a controlling server once it enters a network, and it'll do this periodically. The graph you see in front of you is a capture from Emotet, the recently busted cybercrime group who was at one point known as the world's most dangerous malware. But you can see these spikes on the graph and the very regular intervals of communication that the malware was making back to its controlling server. If we're watching for this, if we have a member of our security staff watching for this, this is something that we're going to be able to spot reasonably easily. And if we can spot this, we can figure out where it's coming from, we can then remove that infection from the network. So that brings us up to one of our big first checks when we're talking about the checklist to work through. Invest in your antivirus and endpoint detection software. In the case that we're referring to previously, the client was utilizing the built-in Windows Defender antivirus as their only means of protection. Now, I don't want to make it sound like Windows Defender is useless. It is absolutely useful. It is just not what I would consider to be a one-size-fits-all solution, especially for an enterprise network. We'll want to move up into something a little bit more heavy-duty, something like Sophos or Carbon Black, CrowdStrike Falcon, Defender APT from Microsoft also does a pretty good job of this. But we're looking for something that has next-gen capabilities. We want it to do signature detection like standard antivirus. We also want it to do behavioral detection. So we want it to look at what is happening on the network versus what is on the network. We want to be able to centralize the management of these pieces of software, and then we want to be able to retain the logs from them. And most of the upper end offerings from the companies like the ones you see on the screen in front of you offer these capabilities. So they integrate very, very well into a standard antivirus rotation. All right, so what about this last piece, though, on the pyramid of pain, when we're talking about TTPs, or tactics, techniques, and procedures that an adversary might be using in the network? Well, this is where we have to start talking about threat hunting. And threat hunting is a big part of any response at this point, and honestly something we recommend that people do proactively. Every once in a while, every quarter, every 6 months, something like that. Take some time and actually do a search of your network. Look for those really subtle indicators that something might be wrong. Look for high-risk applications. Look for high-risk user behavior, potentially unwanted programs, malware. These are things that can all kind of fly under the radar for automated security checks, but with some basic knowledge of how to perform these tasks and what to look for, a threat hunter can spot these pretty quickly. And that's what we ended up doing for this client. We deployed the Carbon Black EDR toolkit to everything on their network. They didn't have visibility. We made visibility possible. And this is one of the things that we found. This is a PowerShell command that we identified on one of the workstations inside the environment that was actually running a Cobalt Strike beacon. This was a remote access point for the hackers. Without this kind of visibility, there's a good chance that might have been missed, and the attackers would have been able to maintain access to the network even after we started cleaning things off and bringing them back online. Remember, only missing one of these kind of home beacons that an attacker might be using can lead to a full-on network reinfection, and that's kind of our worst-case scenario during a response. We want to be able to lock out threats, sanitize the network, and get the clients back into a much more secure posture before they start coming back online. We also found some other lurking threats. We found a remote access Trojan on one of the manager's laptops, and after a little bit of investigation, we're able to determine that Trojan had been installed for 61 days prior to the ransomware detonation. This could have been detected much earlier. That's over 2 months worth of time. that could have been used to identify the fact that there was a problem before $5 million worth of ransomware was detonated on the network. So again, just a little bit of investigation, a little bit of proper monitoring could have saved a lot of problems and a lot of money in this case. So let's take a quick time out and talk about how monitoring or threat hunting could have helped in this overall investigation. First off, like I just said, we could have identified suspicious activity during that 61-day dwell time. We could have known that something was wrong on the network. We could have alerted using a web proxy to the access to that mega.co.nz site and blocked the ability to upload files to it. That would have stopped data exfiltration from happening. We could have identified those Cobalt Strike beacons on the network much earlier and possibly prevented any kind of lateral movement. We might have been able to stop them from getting into the server in the first place. And we could also verify if the data was actually stolen. Remember, we kind of had to come to that conclusion because there was no evidence, which is never where we want to be. The view of the activity on the network also becomes very, very important when we're talking about modern high-profile attacks. So this is from the SolarWinds attack that happened last year. SolarWinds was utilizing United States-based virtual cloud services or virtual private servers. The problem that we run into with a lot of these newer style attacks is that this is a common tactic. Previously, an attacker would utilize VPSs or VPN IP addresses that were coming in from outside of the United States, so coming in from places like Norway or Russia or China or somewhere like that. Attackers have wised up and they've really moved into using these US-based services. So being able to identify the kind of needle in a haystack that is this very stealthy way of getting data and traffic out of the network becomes really important. And again, you can do that with proper threat hunting and proper instrumentation. Here's another screenshot from Carbon Black. This is also SolarWinds. This is that evasive and malicious network communication. And what we're seeing here is what's referred to as jitter. So we talked about C2 traffic or command and control traffic already being pretty regular. Attackers will alter the amount of time in between when these communications happen. So we need to be able to spot this regardless of the fact that it's coming in at exactly every 5 minutes, or if there's an alternating timeline going anywhere between 90 minutes to 2 hours. Making it a little bit more difficult to spot. But again, not impossible, we just need to be instrumented correctly for it. This also brings up another really important question about the monitoring going on in your network, and that's who is watching what's happening as the data is coming in. Monitoring is a 24-hour job. There is a reason that a lot of attacks happen when no one is in the office, and that's because attackers know that there is a much lower chance of them being discovered and a much better chance of them being able to complete their activities before anyone discovers what happened. And most of the cyber attacks we go through are no different. Staffing may not support this kind of consistent monitoring. You may not have 24-hour access to this. There's also some specialized skills and tools that on-site IT staff might not be trained in or might not have access to that can make this a lot more difficult. Remember, IT staff is not security staff, and security staff is not IT staff. There is overlap between the two of those, but there are specialized skill sets for both of those individual pieces of your organization that really need to be accounted for. So yeah, on-site staff or IT staff may not be trained on how to respond to a security incident. It happens. So another check for your checklist as we're moving through here, and that's assigning responsibility for triage and response. We need to know who in the organization is capable of evaluating alerts, determining urgency of the alerts, and the next steps that are going to be needed on the network. We need to be able to empower them to escalate as needed and then preserve and respond based on what they find. We also need quick containment by first responders. First responders need to be educated on how to contain a malicious outbreak, as opposed to just why they need to do it. It's a very quick and easy process if you know what to do. We also need to empower them, again, to call in more support for widespread events if needed. We don't want to have a question of power. We don't want to have delays in asking up the chain for things. We need to be able to make sure that what needs to happen in the network can happen quickly and have those responsibilities kind of doled out ahead of time. We also want to have an on-call process. We want to be able to respond to events at any point in time. And this can be difficult for small businesses, which is why the use of managed service providers becomes such a useful tactic. In the Kaseya attack, the attack took place late Friday afternoon on 4th of July weekend. Now, the timing on that was not at all coincidental. There was a reason the attackers were doing that. In 76% of cases, ransomware actually gets executed outside of work hours. We only see 24% of cases that go somewhere between 8 and 6 p.m. on weekdays. So most of the time, the attackers are looking for those downtimes, those opportunities to impact the network without anyone actively watching it to maximize their chance of success and their return on investment. So again, something to keep in mind. Okay, so let's move out of our unfortunately configured client and move into another client who had things put together in a little bit more successful of a way. And you can see the difference in the outcomes of the investigation here. So this was an employment verification service that we were working with. Had a public-facing web server that was used to accept and store the applications that they were verifying. There was about 500,000 applicants' data contained inside of the databases that this web server was connected to. And again, these were job applications. They contained things like name, address, date of birth, social security number, a lot of very sensitive information that if it does get out and is exfiltrated during a cyber incident, likely needs to be reported as a data breach or at least a data exposure event. So we wanted to take this one or watch this one very closely and come to the best conclusion that we possibly could. So what happened in this case? Well, an attacker was able to exploit the web server and install what's called a web shell. And a web shell is a piece of software that can give you basically command line access to a server that's facing the public internet. It gives you pretty much 24-hour access to it. The attackers used this to gain full access to the server and were able to do a couple of tasks to do things like steal passwords, install additional backdoors, and potentially access the data that was in the connected database servers for this particular web server. So again, the questions that we always want to ask: how exactly did they get in? Do they still have access? Did they move to other servers on the network? Was there lateral movement involved? Did they gain access to the database? Was that data stolen? And again, what laws, regulations, or contracts relate? For an employment verification service that handles employment applications from pretty much every state in the United States, that becomes a really, really big question because those are 50 individual data breach laws that they may be falling under. This brings up the concept of the investigation before the investigation, and this is a very common piece of activity for us when we start a new case. We want to know exactly what we're looking at inside of a network. So the questions we ask in return are: what log data is available? Where is that log data stored? How long is the retention period? And most importantly, is that log data actually accessible? Is there a Syslog server we can log into? Is there a SIM we can log into? Or is this stored on magnetic backup tapes that we're going to have to plug in custom hardware or de-archive to be able to get access to? How long is this going to take? So very important questions. But it also brings up the second portion of network infrastructure that we really like to stress in terms of being able to actively and accurately maintain and monitor this data, and that is the Security Information and Event Management System, or a SIM. Now, SIMs are very, very popular, especially in larger networks, because they offer really, really nice features. They can aggregate and analyze logs from many, many different sources and security alerts. They can pull in data from things like firewalls, servers, switches and routers, intrusion detection or prevention systems. And we can actually perform some pretty detailed analysis directly with the SIM, depending on which manufacturer we're using. We can look at things like event logs. We can look at events that cause network applications to issue an alert, like evidence of brute force attacks or malware-like activity. This becomes really important. We can also, as I mentioned before, pipe in that IDS data. Which brings up our next piece, the intrusion detection system. Intrusion detection systems are, in a lot of cases, a low-cost and high-success method of at least notifying when something bad happens on a system. And there are multiple types of these available. There is network-based intrusion detection. There's hardware-based. There is a anomaly-based intrusion detection system, which looks at the baseline of your network and alerts you when something looks different or out of place. And there's a lot of open source options. So things like Suricata or Zeek or Snort are all great individual offerings to take a look at if you'd like to do something with an intrusion detection system on your network. Highly recommend at least checking it out anyway. So this is actually what informed the client that something was wrong in the first place. They got an alert from their IDS system that there was some suspicious activity happening with the database that needed to be investigated further. So that's what they did. When we got in and ran our initial investigation, we discovered a litany of logs on the network. They almost had too much log data, which is never a bad place to find yourself in during an investigation. They had Internet Information Services logs from the web server maintained for 18 months. They had flow records, network flow data maintained for 12 months. They had IDS logs maintained for 6 months. All of this was being sent to a centralized SIM. It was backed up daily. and the backups were non-writable. So even if someone did get access to them, they could not delete or otherwise alter those backups. We were able to pull all of that data back in. And that was, again, very useful and critical in our ability to come to a solid conclusion on this case. Now, I mentioned flow records on the previous slide as a great example of a piece of network information that you can pretty easily maintain on your overall network and in your monitoring and logging plan. Flow records are generated by a lot of different pieces of, or a lot of different devices that are likely already on your network. So things like firewalls and routers are very good at this. They maintain basically the source address of traffic, the destination address, the type of traffic, the volume of data, and the direction of transfer. This is a very small amount of data which contains a very large amount of actionable information. So they're very easy to maintain for a long period of time and absolutely should be maintained as a part of your standard practice. With the flow records, what we wanted to find out was there outbound traffic going out to a malicious IP address? This comes back to the was data stolen question of the investigation. If we could identify traffic out to malicious IP addresses, there's a pretty good chance that there was some data going out the door. If we could rule that out, that puts us in a pretty good position to say that they may not have got any of the data out of the network. Next up, we talked about web proxies a little while back. Web proxies are a really important part of any network architecture, and there's a lot of information we can get off these. Basically, we can mediate user access to the internet, so record user internet activity and control web access. If there's specific websites we don't want people to be able to access, we can set up a web proxy to block that and make our general kind of overall security posture a lot stronger. And the types of evidence we can get off this are things like the web surfing history with dates, times, and full URLs of websites that were visited. Sometimes we can get cached web pages and images so we can see what the actual user was seeing. Again, very useful information. So what we were looking for here was connection to file upload services, looking for connections out to like Dropbox or to that mega.co.nz repository. Something that would indicate to us that malicious activity was happening and that data may have gone out to a website where it wasn't supposed to go to. All right, so based on all of this data, we were able to put together an incredibly detailed timeline of events, and this was really, really helpful for the client, which we'll talk about on the next slide here. But based on our investigation, we were able to determine the adversary entered their network at 12:07 a.m. on a Monday. The activity that the adversary was able to undertake was successfully cut off at 11:25 a.m. on that same day because the alert had happened, the activity had been noticed, and the means of entry had been wiped out immediately. We were able to use those same logs to verify that no additional activity was happening. Now, we were also to identify that ProcDump was being used and a couple other Windows toolkits to do things like scrape credentials. And knowing this, we were able to advise the client to immediately push a full password reset to all users that were connected to the system to eliminate the possibility of a compromised password being used to access something else on the network. And again, we might not have known this had we not had the data available to tell us this is exactly what the attacker had done while they were in the system. So here's the key results, and this became the most important part of the investigation. What did the adversary actually get done while they were in the network for that about 12-hour period of time? Well, we were able to look at logs from the web server and determine that they had tried and failed to export database tables from the employment verification database service over 70 times. This was a really, really important finding. They had really attempted to get in there, but they had not been successfully able to pull that data back out. Whether this is from inexperience on the hacker side or some other problem they were running into, doesn't really matter. The point is we could see that they did not successfully pull data back out of it. We could also see flow records, which indicated that no large amounts of data had been exfiltrated out to a potentially malicious IP address. This was, again, a very important finding. And we also were able to identify that no lateral movement had occurred. Everything was isolated to the one web server and the one database server that the attacker had gone after. Using these, we were actually able to rule out a data breach, or at least provide a strong enough argument that the attorney on the case was able to rule out the breach in their findings. So again, this is an optimal response here. This is exactly what we want to happen, because again, we don't want to be reporting when we don't have something to actually report. If we can rule it out, we're in great shape. So, quick time out here. How could this have been worse? And it could have been much worse. We run into the prospect of over-reporting, reporting a data breach when something might not have actually happened. This also brings up the issue of fines, of lawsuits, of reputation damage. All of these are very, very important to the outcome of a cybersecurity investigation. And if we can stop any of these from happening, that puts the client in a much better position, puts their insurance company in a much better position, and it proves that having this data available and properly maintaining these networks in the first place is a very, very worthwhile investment to any executive crew that might be curious about that. That's a hint for the IT guys. All right, so this brings up another item on our checklist. We want to make sure that we set up log collection and storage well in advance of anything happening on the network. This is not something we want to be rolling out right when a ransomware attack happens. And where do we want this data to come from? Well, the answer to that is more or less everywhere. We'd like to get data from workstations, from servers. We'd like critical application data. We'd like sensitive data repositories, anything that's maintaining medical information or financial information. If something bad is happening on those systems, we'd like to know about it. So let's get the log data off of it. Also cloud storage, which we'll talk about here in just a minute, has its own unique set of challenges as far as being able to, one, monitor what's happening in your cloud environments, and two, maintain that data for a long period of time. Obviously, we also want to look at email. That's a treasure trove of potentially sensitive information and anything else on the network that we can think of. So what are some major challenges when we're setting up these monitoring and logging programs? Well, there is the prospect of incomplete monitoring inventory. We may not know which applications in our network actually produce log data, which of those applications are producing actionable log data, and whether or not that data is truly accurate. So if there is a problem with an internal system clock that's going to make timestamps not add up correctly, or if the data that the application puts out just was never really vetted or meant for full investigation and may contain errors or be missing critical pieces of information. We can also see improper logging configuration. So this can lead to a few different problems. Logs being shipped off to a server on the network that doesn't exist. Incomplete data transfers. Logs being rolled out of systems too quickly, so we don't have a far enough look back. There's a lot that goes along with this. Data bloat is something I figured I'd put in here too, because it really does become a problem. Data bloat is basically the concept of having way too much data to actually handle, and this is a very easy position to find yourself in if you're new to setting up one of these situations. We want to be able to retain enough data that we can tell important things that are happening on the network, but we don't want so much data that it becomes an unmanageable beast. We want to be able to actually utilize this for something, and if we can cut our amount of data down to gigabytes worth of data instead of terabytes worth of data, that makes it a lot easier for us to work through. Also, alert fatigue is a very real thing. If alerting is not configured properly and your security staff is being alerted, every 30 seconds to some problem on the network that isn't really a problem, there's a good chance they're going to get complacent and miss a larger alert coming in because it kind of blends in with the background of all of the other inconsequential pieces of information that are being thrown at them. And then decentralized cloud logging. We'll go into that right now. So for our last case study, we're going to talk about how the cloud kind of integrates into this and what steps we can take to make sure that our cloud log data is accounted for, is being used appropriately, and is available if we need it. So the company that we were working for was, we'll call them a professional services company. Names are changed to protect the innocent. They had a single user account compromised through a phishing email, which is very common in cloud-based email systems. The one compromised account was then used to compromise multiple other accounts inside of the network, although at that time there was some question as to how many actual accounts had been compromised. IT staff performed their own initial investigation and determined that 17 accounts had been compromised. In the final write-up that they did, the attorneys that were working with them and the cyber insurance that were working with them looked at their conclusions and found their conclusions to be lacking in a lot of detail. And so they pulled in us to do a follow-up investigation and see if we could, at the very least, verify the conclusions they had come to. This is where the problems really started. So the IT staff did not actually retain any of the log data that they had pulled down for their investigation. They had looked at it through the Microsoft Office 365 Audit Center. They had taken a couple screenshots of some reports they had pulled back, but none of that data was actually retained and stored so we could access it later on down the road. Now, they had an Office 365 E3 tenant. In Office 365 E3, you have a default 90-day retention period for your audit log data. The case was turned over to us 94 days after the initial access had happened. So there was a bit of a lag in information between when we were able to start investigating through the audit logs and when the actual information of note would have been recorded. There are some other steps we could take using things like eDiscovery and mail trace records to come up with a pretty decent approximation for the activity that had been undertaken, but it would have been much easier and faster to just have that log data available. So this brings up another important piece of the checklist. Know your default retention times for your cloud services. With Office 365 E3, you get 90 days. If you have an enhanced security license or the E5 level of product from Office 365, you have 365 days. So a significant difference in the amount of log retention between those two between those two service levels. AWS services are kind of interesting. With AWS, you can basically go anywhere you want to with the log data. Out of the box, you have pretty much nothing. A lot of stuff is not turned on by default, which is that's standard for a lot of cloud services, and there's no real default retention time set up. You can have your AWS logs retained unlimited or for an unlimited period of time if you're willing to pay for it, because AWS logs largely get stored in S3 and you have to pay for the storage. So keep that in mind. There's a price associated with some of these. Dropbox is an example of kind of a short one. 28 days is all you get for Dropbox. G Suite has 180 days worth of logs, but only for some areas of the G Suite tenant that you can work through. Other logs roll over in as little as 14 days. So keep that in mind. And then I figured I'd throw Slack on there, since a lot of people are now using things like Slack and Teams for communication, sometimes for file transfers. Slack will maintain your data forever, unless you tell it not to, which is kind of nice, or bad, depending on how much you pass through Slack and whether or not you want to treat it kind of like a filing cabinet. So anyway, those are not the only retention times to keep in mind, but it's a good way to get started. So let's talk about O365 first. Office 365 has made some great strides in the available content that they offer as far as monitoring and logging capabilities go over the last couple of years. If you've watched our presentations, you'll remember us talking about the Magic Unicorn tool from a couple of years ago. A lot of the really important pieces of log data that we were able to discover with those kind of toolkits are now available in a fully authorized and vetted information system for Microsoft. So we love seeing that. But this is kind of what that looks like. This is the Microsoft 365 Compliance Center. This is where you can come for things like reports, automated alerting, audit log searches, e-discovery, a lot of great stuff in here. First thing you need to do, though, is verify that your logging is enabled. Now, there is no additional cost for E3 and E5 customers to turn this logging on, and it's been on by default for all new tenants since about 2020. If you've had your Office 365 tenant longer than that, it's probably worth it to check if your logging is actually enabled and is actively storing that data. Also, if you're buying your Office 365 from a reseller, someone like GoDaddy or Rackspace or Vendasta, there is a chance that the audit logging is not enabled, or at least is not enabled for you in that case. It's again, one of those things that you need to talk to your reseller about. Make sure that they are maintaining this data and that you have the ability to access it if it is necessary for an investigation. Also, it's important to note that logs from before auditing is enabled inside of a network are very, very difficult to obtain, if not impossible. Logging starts from the second you turn the switch on. Nothing before that really gets logged. There are some legal tactics you can take to obtain this data from Microsoft using legal counsel and information requests from them, but they are long requests. They take a while to process. They're oftentimes denied and are in a lot of cases not valuable enough to spend the time to do. So just something to keep in mind. So here's some of the pieces of information you can get out of the standard audit logs in Office 365, and it's very comprehensive. It gives you a great view of what is happening inside the tenant. We can get things like mailbox item activity. We can get user log on and log off events, message movement, forwarding information, or forwarding rule creation. And if you have either the E3 Enhanced Security license or the E5 tenant license, you can look for mail items accessed, which is a really important piece of a business email compromise case. Was email actually accessed during the time the account was compromised? Something we'd probably want to know. I would assume you would too. You can also set up custom retention policies, and this is a fairly new feature that I was really excited to see roll out. When we're talking about things like SharePoint file operations, we can extend the period of time that we keep individual sets of log data for individual users or groups. In this case, the example you see is set up to look at our user Owen Abel and all of his file access, file copy, and file delete activities inside of SharePoint. We can retain that for up to 10 years, which is a really nice feature to have. Cloud DLP is also really important to have available to you, and most of the large cloud providers that people utilize have this in. If you're not familiar with it, DLP is data loss prevention. It's basically set up to detect risky or improper configurations or activity on your network, any potential exposure of sensitive data, where that sensitive data might sit, alert you to it and allow you to stop it. So you can do things like know where your data is, prevent that data from being lost, govern it, and protect it. Very, very important pieces of infrastructure to have available to you. And it is available depending on your tenant level, either no cost or a pretty reasonably small cost. So again, something to take a look at. Now, as far as overall security goes, some other changes have happened inside the Office 365 tenant that are very, very useful. One of them is the updated security and compliance score. Microsoft will actually do an automated scan of your entire environment and provide you with a compliance score and a list of steps you can take to improve that security posture and make yourself or put yourself into a better position to avoid security problems down the road. Okay, so back to our case. We were able to get a lot of the data back out from the Office 365 tenant for the email accounts that we were looking for, and we came to a pretty significantly different conclusion than the original investigators had come to. Remember, they said 17 accounts had been compromised. We were able to determine that only 9 accounts were actually compromised during this event. We were also able to identify the original phishing email and use that to identify where else in the company it had been set, who was at risk because they clicked on the phishing email, who had then followed the link out to the phishing website. And then we were able to utilize similar indicators of compromise between the accounts that we knew were taken over to basically determine that other accounts were not compromised. They were things like hotspot activity or logging in from a home computer that we could rule out. No evidence of cloud document access was also identified. That was a huge thing for this client. They had a lot of sensitive data in their SharePoint, wanted to make sure that hadn't been accessed or exfiltrated, and we could see pretty conclusively that it was not. And we were able to cut their e-discovery bill by about 50 gigabytes worth of data. Now, 50 gigabytes worth of data in e-discovery is significant. E-discovery firms, I'm not sure if you've ever worked with one, but they charge you for investigation of this data by the gigabyte, and they are not cheap by any means. 50 gigabytes of data is a significant savings and also makes the process run a lot faster. So that was a good conclusion. We were pretty happy with that one. Obviously, we'd love to tell clients every time that nothing bad happened, but if we can at least minimize the amount of negative impact, that's going to get us all into a better position. This also brings up an interesting point, though. You want to keep an eye on your team. Communication and compliance and insider risk management are really big pieces of why we want to keep such a close eye on the network, especially when we're talking about cloud services. Human error is actually responsible for most data breaches, at least in 2020 and 2021 at this point. 60% of organizations reported losing data because of a data breach. Another 52% had credible or credentials or accounts compromised, again, just because of human error. 47% of organizations infected with ransomware also claimed human error to be the number one cause of that. And this is a reoccurring trend. We've seen this for years now. Now, I get in trouble for saying that the human element is a weak point on the system, and I don't mean that to be insulting to any users or anything like that, but it is the primary way that malware enters the network and that credentials are harvested, and we can prove that with the numbers. This is a quick survey that was put out by Tessian talking about users in an organization who actually did click on a phishing email and why they clicked on it, why they actually fell for the phish. Number one reason was simple distraction. They were thinking about something else. They were trying to work through their day quickly. The email popped up, they clicked it, and that was the end of it. The other one is the email looked legitimate. Hackers are very good at making emails look like they're coming from someone they're not coming from. And that is a very common way they get past basically the spot check of whether or not an email is legitimate. And then 41% of the time the email was supposedly from a senior executive at my organization, or in this case, another member of the organization. If one account is compromised and is used to send out phishing emails to other people in the organization, there's a much better chance people are actually going to click on and trust that email because it's coming from someone they know. Not the actual user itself, but the account anyway. So this brings up some other pieces of cloud infrastructure that we want to look at. We've already talked about phishing, we've talked about email, we've talked about SharePoint, but what about your large-scale cloud storage services like AWS, like S3? Amazon offers a number of really good features that can take care of the logging and monitoring issues for you and make this a lot easier. If you've worked with AWS before, I'm sure you're familiar with Amazon CloudWatch and CloudTrail. These basically cover the resources and API access for all of the pieces of Amazon infrastructure that you're running, and they contain a wealth of data that can be very, very useful in the case something goes wrong or something's just not working correctly. This is not really enabled by default, though. That is something that we do need to keep in mind. It's not difficult to turn on by any means, but you do have to go in some cases and specify the exact pieces of infrastructure that you'd like to have logging available for, enable detailed monitoring, set up log storage. So there's a couple steps that you have to go through. Again, this is not an impossible task. It's not even a hard task to do, but it is a little bit time consuming and something that you will need to keep an eye on. Also, visibility can come at a price, and this Amazon is not the only company that does this. This is common in a lot of online storage systems. But a majority of organizations lack visibility into their security and compliance study, or sorry, their cloud infrastructure security and compliance logs because of difficulties getting these pieces out. In Amazon's case, you have to enable detailed monitoring, which then starts charging you for space inside of S3, and this can become very, very expensive if you're not prepared to make that investment. So again, keep a tab on how much data you have. This is usually charged by the gigabyte. That can cause problems for you moving down the road if you're not prepared for how much that actually costs. We also want to budget for security features. It's one thing just to have the data stored somewhere. We also want to be able to act on it and analyze it quickly. We'll use Amazon again as the example here. Amazon offers a really nice service called Amazon Detective, and this is constantly being updated and tweaked to make it a little bit more efficient and useful. But basically, it looks at all of the aggregate log data that you have in place in your S3 infrastructure, and it can kind of correlate those logs together and start giving you automated alerting as to when something bad might be happening. So we're talking about CloudTrail logs, VPC flow logs, guard duty findings, which are other automated alerts you can enable. And the alerts that they give you are actually very, very helpful. They can not only tell you if there's an attack happening or something, somebody trying to break into the network, but even if you just have a poor configuration or something that's making your experience not optimal with the services. Again, this does charge by the gigabyte. So for the first 1,000 gigabytes worth of data that it looks at, it's about $2 per gigabyte. And again, that can get expensive pretty quickly if you have a large-scale network and you're maintaining a lot of CloudWatch data. We also want to take advantage of automated alerting anywhere we can. Again, we're going to use Amazon for the example on this one, but this is not the only online service that offers automated alerting. If it's offered, we highly recommend you take advantage of it. In Amazon's case, we can set up automated alerting for things like guard duty findings, for suspicious activity, for overusage or underusage of a system. We can set up alerts for when data is being pulled out of an S3 bucket or loaded into an S3 bucket, so we can check data exfiltration. A lot of different things we can look for, and you can custom define these to absolutely suit the exact environment that you're using. This isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. It's very, very customizable, and we actually really recommend it. All right, so this is our last little bit of this. We want to be able to centralize our logging. If we're using something like Dropbox and AWS and Office 365, we don't want to be digging around for all of those logs in all those different places all the time. We want to be able to put these in one centralized location and have them at our fingertips whenever we need to actually look at them or would like to. So we want to be able to aggregate from as many sources as possible. We want easy access in the case of an emergency. We want to correlate the data between those sources. This can help facilitate an investigation. It can reduce costs and damages, and we want to be able to utilize cloud and on-site together to make this happen. If we can make a hybrid out of this, it makes the entire thing a lot faster and easier to work through. A good example of aggregation software is something like the Elastic Stack, or the ELK Stack, as it's commonly referred to. Now, this is a piece of software that we actually use in our forensics lab pretty frequently. I really like using it. It's open source. It's very, very powerful and provides a lot of utility for what it's actually built for. But the ELK Stack is basically built on a series of applications that work together to provide data storage, indexing, and visualization. So we're really talking about Elasticsearch, Logstash, and Kibana, or ELK. This is kind of what that looks like. This is a screenshot of audit log data that I pulled out of Microsoft Office 365. Doing some test investigations on what a brute force attack looks like. So you can see the exact date and time the logs happened. You can see the operation, the location of the IP the client was coming in from, what the actual logon error was, and then the user ID that was being utilized at that point. Being able to set these filters up quickly and easily means that I can parse through this data really, really fast, even though I've got a lot of it to look through. And I can find those really interesting and actionable pieces of data without having to wade through a bunch of junk to find it, basically. So it really keeps things moving. Now, ELK's not the only one. We can also talk about Splunk. They offer a great online kind of log retention and aggregation service, along with many other services. They also have built-in connectors for a lot of those really common cloud applications that we use. So things like Office 365, AWS, Dropbox. You can pipe that data directly into a Splunk online instance and have it all just right there at your fingertips. So very, very useful. There is a charge to use this if you're outside the free tier. So again, budget for it, keep it in mind. But it's a great service and provides a lot of utility. It also gives you access to custom dashboards. So this is an example of the Office 365 dashboard that you can use through the Splunk online services. And you see we get our standard Active Directory, we get our SharePoint stats, we get our workload stats, a lot of stuff right at our fingertips that IT staff and security staff can use to pretty quickly determine what's happening with an overall cloud tenant. All right, so overall takeaways. When we're talking about monitoring and logging, the big reasons we want to do this are, one, we want to be able to conduct threat hunting and investigations as needed. If something is going wrong, we want to be able to find where that problem is. We also want to invest in our antivirus and endpoint detection. These pieces of software, while they do come with a price tag, are essential in keeping your network clean and secure, and for responding if something bad does happen. We want to set up our log collection well in advance of an incident happening. This is not something we want to be doing during a recovery from a ransomware incident. We want this to be already ready to go so that we can use it to investigate. We want to assign responsibility for triage and response, have those responsibilities very clearly spelled out in our organization so that we know exactly who's watching and when they're watching. We want to have an on-call process, so we've got our weekends and our evenings covered. There's going to be no coming in Monday morning to surprise ransomware on your desktop. We want to know default retention time, so we know when we need to be taking this data and preserving it offline with our cloud services. And then we also want to centralize our logging data. All right, so thank you so much, everyone. Again, my name is Matt Duran, security consultant with LMG Security. If you have any questions whatsoever, please feel free to ask them. You can email me at mduran@lmgsecurity.com, follow us on Twitter, look me up on LinkedIn, and thank you again.